Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Warm greetings to Cambridge University Library. I'm Dr. Jessica Gardner. I'm the University Librarian and Director of Library Services here at the University of Cambridge. And I'm so pleased you've joined us to celebrate the wonderful Spitting Image Archive here at the University Library. The award-winning series held to account politicians, celebrities, and members of the royal family in the 1980s and 90s, and how well we remember it. And it has, of course, now returned to our screens to take on a new era with its iconic no-holds-barred style. There is no doubt that Spitting Image revolutionised political satire for a generation, and the archive takes pride of place alongside centuries of satirical material at the library, including the printed works of James Gilroy and the archives of the university's famous ADC Theatre and, of course, Footlights, of which we might hear more later. Not to mention Robert Walpole's papers relating to his attempts to suppress the press and critics of his government, which, of course, is why political satire matters so much. Political satire, which has provided catharsis for generations, is our topic today, with three very special guests who I'm so pleased to have with us. Let me welcome them and introduce them to you. We have Dr. Lucy Delap, who is a reader in modern British history, modern British and gender history at Cambridge University. Roger Law, who barely needs an introduction, who is the co-creator of Spitting Image. And a little while later, we will also meet Matt Ford, who is the comedian and voice actor in the new series. And all are here, very special guests to discuss with us Spitting Image and political satire. Take it away, Lucy.
Thanks so much, Jess. Welcome, everybody. We've got a great lineup for you. And Roger's going to kick us off now with a few thoughts about Spitting Image and the kind of the heritage, the big story of his work through Spitting Image. So, Roger.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We're here for a spot of culture and a very short talk about caricature. So let's start when caricature really took off, and that would be with Mr. Gilray, 1756 to 1815. He was probably the greatest caricaturist this country has ever produced. The decades that he was on top of his form became known as the golden age of caricature. The Cambridge University Library has some fine examples of his work and some of his more salacious offerings, which were displayed in the smoking room after dinner amongst the men. His talent was widely recognised at the time. The Prince of Wales had a collection, and the painter Goya also kept his prints in the studio in Madrid. Human nature doesn't change, and the best of Gilray's satirical prints are recycled by every generation as they come along. For instance, Britannia having her corset tightened in the Paris fashion by the revolutionary Tom Rights of Man Paine. And the image on the other side is my version of Elvis having his corset tightened by his agent, Colonel Tom Parker. And of course, it's a direct lift from Fashion Before Ease. Strong ideas can be recycled from generation to generation, as you will see. This is Gilray's The Plum Pudding in Danger, Prime Minister Pitt and Napoleon carving up the world, followed by Spitting Images, the Thatchers carving up the world. And there she is taking a slice off the UK. Gilray puts an unceremonial touch in the next one to the torrent of fatuous comments that were being made about the Duke and Duchess of York's engagement in 1792. On the right hand, you can see Spitting Images recycling this notion for the very same reasons. On the engagement to Fergie to the Duke of York, the Duke and Duchess of York of 1986. Nothing much changes. The caricature of Britannia with Edward VII as her bottom appeared in a French magazine called L'Assiette-Beurre, roughly translates as the butter dish or the gravy train, and it was published at the turn of the 20th century. Every single page carried drawings or caricatures with libelous captions written by the editor. The idea was to create the maximum embarrassment to the French establishment. All matters of concern were covered: corruption in high places, empire building, quirks of tourists, foreign politicians, prostitutes, royalty, milk, lawyers, and cars. The subjects were dealt with directly and in hilarious terms. I was shown copies of Les Aubert at Cambridge School of Art, and I instantly knew what I would like to do with what little talent I had. This is my version of Richard Nixon as Uncle Sam's Bottom. I never got close to recreating the Asset Aubert in print, but Spitting Image took the magazine's vitality and spray gun satire and ideas from print to a new medium, television, with just as many impossible people involved. Leonardo's Last Supper, with our version, the Spitting Image version, tucked underneath. The diorama was made for a Barbican exhibition called Cutting Edge. The guy drunk on the floor is, of course, Dennis Thatcher. The City of London tried to close the show, allegedly for blasphemy. The director at the Barbican, to his credit, stood his ground. Now, this image of the young Duke of York was a bit too much for the Queen. She approached the Director of Prosecutions and suggested legal action. At this time, they've gone too far, to which the Director of Public Prosecution said, "Ma'am, if you do that, they will probably appear in court with the puppet and the sausages." The idea was quickly forgotten. Spitting Image seems to have a life of its own, and I'm afraid it will probably be here long after I bite the dust. But the best of it needs to be preserved and archived as an inspiration for the following generations, as Gilray and Lasset Aubert was for me half a century ago.
Thank you so much for that, Roger. Really inspirational to see those historical connections. And speaking as someone who teaches the history of comedy and satire, it's just fabulous to see the kind of reflexivity, the self-awareness of your creations of comic humor in today and also in the 1980s and 90s, and to see that historical context. So I'm going to move on now to Matt and ask Matt to tell us about his world and how he entered the world of Spitting Image and his contributions there. Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and hello, everyone. And seeing Roger's work there depicted in the kind of history of satire makes you realise what a special show Spitting Image is. And for me, it's just an unbelievable honour to be involved in it. I'm 38 years old, so when Spitting Image finished, I vaguely remember it at primary school age. I remember people at school talking about how outrageous it was. And at that age, the age of about 9 or 10, I didn't realise what satire was. Spitting Image to me was kind of the South Park of its day. It was the most outrageous show on telly. So it was an illicit treat. It was only as I began to become a comedian myself and become politically interested and really have a love of satire in the 90s, subscribing to Private Eye, watching Have I Got News For You religiously, that Spitting Image obviously became for me just such a special thing in retrospect, almost like rediscovering the Beatles. So to now be involved in it, I mean, firstly, when it was announced it was coming back, I had no presumption that I'd be involved at all and was just delighted as a punter that it was coming back. The only bit of Spitting Image I ever owned was the 1996 video they made after England lost to Germany in the Euro 96 semi-final, which was Gascoigne and Venables. And that was one of the great strengths of Spitting Image, was for all it did, really important satire, lampooning really powerful people, it also took the piss out of celebrities and sports stars, and that's something that I think this modern series has continued. So to be involved in it was incredible. I got involved about a year and a half ago. Avalon, who made the show, were making a taster tape, and they wanted me to voice Donald Trump. I've been doing impressions for 5 or 10 years, and over the last few years, I'd say last 6 or 7 years, I've done various UK tours doing political comedy. And that started around the time of the coalition, when it was, impersonating people like Nick Clegg and David Cameron and Nigel Farage and Ed Miliband. And now when I think about where politics is, with Brexit, Scottish independence, Trump, Boris, Corbyn, and all the things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years in particular, it's clear there's been an explosion in politics that helped fuel that comeback. I think the comeback could have happened at any point, because I don't think you necessarily need someone like Trump or an issue like Brexit to bring these things back. Whoever's in charge, you will always have big characters, you will have incompetence, you will have jealousy, you'll have liars, you'll have mistakes. So spitting image is something that, in my view, as long as you keep it refreshed, could effectively run forever. But it's come back, which is fantastic. And for me, it's just incredible to be a part of it. So I started off voicing Trump, and it was something I was doing as part of my shows. And a lot of people do Donald Trump impressions, and a lot of them are very different. I started off by getting the kind of growl that he has, and almost Cartman-like that he does at his rallies. I know a lot of people start with a very beautiful, very good, very beautiful. But I started with a kind of big, we're going to build a beautiful wall. So that was where I started. And then you with any impression, you kind of start with a base layer, which is that initial, for me, just that initial noise, just that meh, or the whatever it is. With Boris, it's and then from there, it's like painting a door. So you do the undercoat, and then you're always adding. So with Trump over the years, I then started to add. So I started off with, we're going to build a wall, and then was able to do the very gentle things that he does. And then the facial expressions are obviously a big part of that. Now in Spitting Image, the facial expressions are done by the puppet. But even when I'm here recording my bits, I still kind of do the face, because I find, and Rory Bremner gave me this tip, he was very generous, probably the greatest impressionist that's ever lived. If you basically shape your face and mouth like the person you're impersonating, it's almost like playing an instrument. You've got a better chance of actually sounding like them. And anyway, I think if you're an impressionist, you end up doing it. So do the kind of the grimace. We're going to build a beautiful wall. And then it's about then on top of that, thinking like them and saying the sorts of things they would say. So Trump would reassure himself a lot. We're going to make America great again. And I know we're going to do that, by the way, I do know. And it's something that, the rambling style of it, it's something that not a lot of people do believe, but it will happen, and I do know. And having the eyes closed a lot. And then it all just, for an audience, it really adds. And from a performer, it makes it more satisfying. But with Spitting Image, even though I'd be sat at home, because this is where I recorded it because of COVID, you can't see me, obviously, on the show. So in the end, the impression becomes, as well as an impersonation and a caricature of that individual, it also, because of the puppet, you end up doing a voice of a puppet. So it's quite odd. You are simultaneously impersonating a real person, but also a caricature of that person. So it's almost like you're a fictional version of it. It's all, psychologically, it's quite difficult. But in the end, and I think the Trump puppet is one of the most wonderful works of art. I think it is the most grotesque, and it could be, of course, because it's him. So in the end, I ended up slightly changing the voice to suit the puppet. So I would make it kind of squeak more and make sort of puppety noises that Trump doesn't make in real life, but the sort of things it would sound like he might say. So I thought squeaking made him sound funny. So I'd say things like, Mike, we can't trust these people. They're sneaky. I would just make him sound even more ridiculous, because when you see the amazing work that Roger and the people who make the puppets have done, you think, well, the voice should kind of add extra comedy as well, not just sound like the person. So Trump was my first initial involvement. I was then very, very lucky to be asked to write on the show as well, and that was fantastic. So I would be involved in writing some of the sketches I was performing in. I would sometimes write sketches for other characters that I didn't voice. So I kind of saw two ends of it: the writing and then the voicing. I also did Boris Johnson, and with him, again, I think any Boris Johnson impression starts with come. And it starts with a woo. The thing I noticed was he's often incandescent at the start of an answer. So it doesn't matter what he's asked, particularly if it's challenging. Come on. Often looking round for kind of almost like there's going to be a linesman there to give him some sort of come. I do the various verbal tics that he does. So one of them, of course, is the big, we're going to do it. And it's great that we have a vaccine and the energy. And then sometimes what we do is slow right down. And very good, beautiful voice that he's got, regardless of his personality. But there's a slight lisp. You notice these things all the time. But he would slow down. So when you're talking about a puppet, he would really sort of enjoy the sound of his own voice even more than he usually would. And then there's the things that he does where it's almost like he's gone into a room and forgotten what he's gone in for. So he would go, I want to pay tribute to our national national images and the European EU. Putting all those things together. Now, obviously, when I'm voicing a sketch, it might not be one that I've written, and certainly when you're writing sketches with comedy, brevity is crucial. So whereas in my live shows I would really stretch that out and enjoy it because it's about often the physical impression as well. On Spitting Image, you're having to sort of do those things really subtly and really quickly. So on scripts, even if there wasn't kind of Boris waffle required, I'd always try and just get a little bit. So even if the line was "Hello and Merry Christmas," I'd just try and get a little bit in at the start. Hello and Merry Christmas, and just try and get that flavour of Boris in there. I have to say in closing that one of the weird elements of this, obviously, has just been doing it all from my spare room. So all the bits I wrote were here, and all the bits I voiced in this microphone in this laptop, rather than in the studio. But in that brief dip, where the numbers were going the right way on COVID, I was able to just, for a couple of hours, go to the studio where it's filmed, and it was like going to Disneyland. And I said that having never been to Disneyland, but I kind of imagine the sets are huge, and it was, and obviously I kind of get this from watching it, but the amount of care, the amount of detail, the amount of love that goes into filming sometimes a 10-second sketch. They've created these huge sets, and the puppets are massive and they're lifelike, and the puppeteers are incredible. And we can talk about that perhaps because they are so responsible for the comedy of it, the puppeteers. But you realise it in a world where so many things now are CGI and computer, and they don't quite look the same. People often say this about 80s films, things like Goonies and Gremlins and stuff. There was something about having Jim Henson puppets and things that gave those shows and films a heart and soul. And Spitting Image really has ended up becoming the kind of last bastion of that, because part of the comedy is, I think it's probably for an audience, it's on a subconscious level, is that, holy shit, they built a whole thing and they've sculpted these amazing puppets for a 5-second joke. And in the end, there is something funny about that. That's so much artistry, so much talent in the writing, the voicing, the creation, the direction, think of all the people involved in just that one little bit, just to get that thing, and to put that much care and love and attention into it, as well as all the very important grand themes of satire, I think is part of the joy of the show. So as you can probably tell, I still haven't fully dealt with the fact that I'm involved in Spitting Image, and it is just a wonderful honour.
Thanks, Matt. I was giggling too much there, hoping that I wouldn't be brought in suddenly. Too much laughing. That was really fantastic. We've got a chance now to have a discussion, but I just want to say to all the audience, now's your chance to dive into the Q&A bit where you can type in and do pose questions, please, to Matt or Roger or myself. We'd be very happy to answer anything. And I'm just going to stick with you, Matt. Grab your drink now, but can you tell us, like, how it seems such a gift, doesn't it, to have Trump and Johnson? They're just like gifts to the satirist. What would you be doing to develop a voice for? I mean, let's imagine Jeremy Hunt or Matt Hancock as our next PM. Like, what would you work on there?
There's less of something to go on. I mean, with Jeremy Hunt, I always thought he had that sort of weird, quite sort of starry-eyed. He's almost like a sort of puppet, the way he moves. And of course, so many of those people, you've kind of hit upon a point, sound kind of the same. Tony Blair, Rishi Sunak, Ed Miliband. Tony Blair basically sounds like that, and it's great to be with you tonight to talk about these very important things. And Rishi Sunak sounds a bit like that, whatever it takes. And Ed Miliband sort of is, Tony Blair with a cold. And then Keir Starmer, I agree with the government when they get things right, Mr. Speaker. I disagree with them when they get them wrong. He sounds like he's got a blocked nose. And they're all kind of upper middle class white guys who are, if they were on a dartboard, they'd all be around kind of treble 20. You're aiming at quite a narrow band to try and get all these voices in. So with Hancock and with Hunt, I mean, obviously with Hancock, you'd have him crying now. He'd be the kind of Gascoigne of the new series. You'd have him blubbing at everything. But yes, vocally, Hunt and Hancock aren't distinct, so that would be a challenge. I guess you start with a general, you sound kind of quite middle class as a white kind of well-educated posh guy, and then you go from there, and you try and I would just watch them and try and get any discernible hook. And for Hancock, obviously, it would be blubbing like a child.
And for you, Roger, like where would you go with these figures, these sort of grayer figures? How would you produce the puppet?
You take a really good look at their face. Jeremy Hunt had white space above his eyes. It didn't matter where he was looking, you had this white space between his eyelid and his eye, which made him look totally matte.
This is Roger Law.
So you'd emphasize that. One of the nicest things that happened on this series was Cummings' eyes, because we ultimately decided to use not put an eye in, an iris. We just had the iris shape on a piece of tin, a round piece of tin, which had a string that attached to the eyeball. So when you shake it like that, his eyes are all over the place. And what's the name of that chap that's got the car, Matt?
Oh, what car?
You know, he invented a car. He's in a series.
Oh, Elon Musk, yes.
Yeah, Elon Musk has got the same problem. His eyes just move all the time. So there's a universal movement on his eyes. Eyes are very important. And the rest of it's pretty straightforward. I actually could never understand when I used to do caricatures for print. And people say that's absolutely grotesque. And you say, no, it's not. It looks like him. But they didn't see it in quite the same way. I mean, Nixon was wonderful to do because I had a theory that because he lied a lot, his head slid down towards the middle of his chest. So his head got lower and lower over Watergate and stuff like that. And it kind of works. When you're lucky, it kind of works.
Let me stay with you, Roger, there for a moment to ask you about TV. So you've given us these wonderful visions of the world of print, and it's so amazing when you go into the University Library archive that we've got all these incredible sketches to look at, to understand how Spitting Image came into being. But ultimately, this is a TV product. So what kind of challenges did TV pose? What constraints were there? And what opportunities did you have in TV that you haven't got in print?
Well, I'll tell you an anecdote that does explain the difference. We had production value on print. You could be a little bit more subtle. I know that Roger Law and subtle don't go in the same sentence, but our print work did. And when we worked for television, we worked in the same way because I was 42 when we started it. And the kids that we couldn't get 30-year-olds to work for us because they're about to get married or they had kids. But we had teenagers that we used to make sleep under the bench. And they were much more au fait with TV. And they said, look, you're not caricaturing them enough because the television cameras flatten everything. It's not print, guys. It's a new medium. And to demonstrate, they did Barry Manilow, which was basically some hair, a large nose, and a collar that came up to his chin. And then they proceeded to play the piano with his nose. And whichever angle you got of Manilow, it looked like him, and it shouldn't have done. It would have. You couldn't have done that in print. So I don't say we do it all the time, but it's one of the things not to forget. The other thing is, of course, the print things were done from one angle. They weren't necessarily finished behind the ear. They take a while to do. So you do it, you have a sketch, that's what you're doing. You cannot do that on television. A pediatrician told me that babies recognize their mother, not by her face, but by the shape of her head. So you get the shape of the head so that you can move it around even when it's talking backwards. And we did get pretty good at it because we had to do so many bloody puppets. But we did Mike Tyson from the back. We nearly lost our nerve and put a pigeon on his head because he used to keep pigeons. But you could tell instantly who he was. And that's the difference. That's the difference between print and TV from, a practical point, craftsman point of view.
Yeah. And Roger, could you ever reuse puppets? Was it possible to save on the spec and substitute for somebody else?
Well, I used to hate that because it would be, in this woke world we now live in, it would be frowned upon even more. But they used to get desperate. They had a topical gag. And you'd get a phone call from John Lloyd and he'd say, have you got Mrs. Mandela? And you say, well, no, we don't actually, John. And we can't make it because the show's being shot tomorrow. So you say, well, can't you put a woman's wig on Mandela? And things like that would happen simply because what we're doing is a craft process for a medium that doesn't do that. Television is what we're doing now. It's talking heads. End of story. But Spitting Image wasn't like that, because everything you saw on that screen was handmade.
So talking of the craft process, Matt, do you prefer it all to be scripted, or are you best as an ad-libber for your voices?
Well, I think for a show like this, it has to be scripted, because the sketches have a point, and they even on a short sketch, one of the great disciplines that working on this show has taught me is they have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even just a quick 5-second gag has to have a point to it, and it has to have a clear finish. So I out of sort of having seen it at both ends, I kind of, when I then record my voice bits, I keep the ad-libbing down. I'll maybe add in the sort of noises and that, as I described, a bit of bodies out. I mean, some of the funny bits actually are when so a sketch has been written where, if you look at the trailer where there's the fight in the sauna with Boris, Trump and Putin, is on the script, obviously it says the lines, and then there'll be a piece of direction, they fight and they give each other titty twisters or whatever. Obviously in the script there isn't the noise. So then, after having recorded the voice, I got a call a couple of days later that said, oh, actually, you need to make some fighting noises as Trump and Boris. So I just had to sort of sit here in my spare room and just go, and then as Trump, so I was like, oh my God, get off! So then you have to, the amount of just grunts and pants, and I think there was one where Boris's head deflated after Cummings put his finger in his ear. And then they said, oh, just give us some options on Boris's head deflating. So, and then, and you just basically just, God knows what, I live in a flat. God knows what my neighbours think. That sounds a bit like Boris Johnson's head deflating down there. So there's all these other little bits, all the extra little touches that you don't realise are going to be involved when you start.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. So I've got just one more question for both of you, and this is the historian's question. So Roger, you gave us that lovely, overview of the early 20th century inspiration, the 18th century. What about what was going on just before and around the time of Spitting Image? So the satire boom, the Pythons, the alternative comedy scene in the 80s. How much of that was an inspiration for the first Spitting Image series?
I think it wouldn't have happened without the riots in the street. It was a very violent time, actually. People forget that. And there was one program controller who was liberal, possibly slightly left of liberal, who commissioned Spitting Image just because he thought it would be a good balance to what was actually happening in the country. So we were very lucky in that respect. But Spitting Image, the initial Spitting Image, was not a hard sell. You'd seen the puppets in print. People could see if they moved, they were onto something. And a lot of people were very angry, as indeed they are now, about Brexit and the Remainers. It was that situation writ large, really.
Jess, do you want to introduce some of the questions? I see we've got some questions flowing in from our audience.
The questions have come in thick and fast. Can I just say thank you to the three of them? Like Lucy, it's very hard to kind of interrupt because it's such a joyful experience hearing you all talk. But we've had some fantastic questions that have come in, and I don't think the first one will surprise any of you. And I think it'd be great to hear from all three of you on this one, which is really about what are the red lines, or are there anywhere? Where do you stop with satire, or should you not? And I wonder if Roger wants to kick us off, and then Matt, and then Lucy from an academic perspective would be fantastic. Roger.
On the first, I'm really a kind of overseer for the puppets on this show. I'm not as involved because it's a different time. But my feeling about that is you shouldn't censure yourself, because there are plenty of people that will do that, and they do. And it was really quite fantastic because television had never had a political cartoon 23 minutes long, they didn't quite know what to do with it. And we could not believe the stuff we were doing and getting away with. And when we did the Spitting Image book and we tried to resuscitate some of the funnier ideas and outrageous ideas, we could not get them past the lawyers because it was print. Television doesn't matter, but if it's going to be in the dentist's waiting room 3 years later, it does matter. So it got censored. But Spitting Image was a treat. They didn't quite know what to do with this, really.
One of the things that I often bring to my students' attention when we're talking about this question of censorship is the brilliant and probably the most comic document that's ever come out of the BBC, their brilliant guide to light entertainment producers that was produced in 1949 that basically clarified what are the limits of comedy, what can you not do. And they said our maxim as the BBC is, if in doubt, take it out. So they explicitly say no jokes about fig leaves, no jokes about vicars, no jokes about chambermaids. And all impersonations were banned unless the person being impersonated had explicitly given their permission. So I start with that guide in 1949 and show the students how very, very differential British culture and British cultural institutions were in the late 40s, and therefore what a kind of extraordinary bid for freedom it was in the satire programs of the 1960s, where I think radio was actually one of the real precursors of freeing up what could be said, and that gradually that percolates through, as Roger says, into TV. But it's quite slow. If you think about the kind of the political interviews of the 1960s, they're often still quite deferential. Yes, Minister, what would you like to tell us about today? Kind of mode. So by the 80s, I do think it's quite extraordinary the level of offence that can be given. And look at Viz magazine in print culture, which is definitely dealing in the offensive. Although even they decided that jokes about travellers were unacceptable, so even they censored some aspects of their comic stuff.
What about for you?
I think whatever you're writing, you have to be acutely aware of the time in which you exist. And I think particularly when you're making topical comedy and you're making it regularly, you have a fairly good instinct for what you can and can't get away with. And I think most people certainly the people working on shows like Spitting Image would never want to deliberately do things that were racist, misogynist, transphobic, or anything that would be seen as prejudiced. I think when you're going for individuals, perhaps the bar is somewhere else. But these things are always done collectively. And I think I've been doing stand-up for quite some time. I've been on and worked on various topical shows. And I think as the years go by, I can even...
Matt, you're muted. You might have leant on your space bar there.
a sign came up saying the host had muted me. So censorship is alive and well, it turns out. It's a shame. I was saying some really racist things there, but obviously they've now not been broadcast. But yes, I think you get a pretty good antenna when you're working on shows regularly and you know where the line is. But you do that knowing that in 3 years' time the line may be somewhere else, and that the stuff we're writing in 2020 may look very dated very quickly.
I wonder if I can come in, just pick up on your observation. They use the word collective there, Matt, and one of the questions that's come through is around what are the essential ingredients for a Spitting Image character, and I wondered, particularly if Roger and Matt could draw on that from the point of view of this coming together, which Spitting Image is this extraordinary mix of writer, artist, puppet maker, script screenwriters. I mean, it is an extraordinary creative process, and I wonder whether Roger might kick us up in what makes a successful character and what is that process behind that.
There's absolutely no point in doing a caricature of somebody nobody knows. It has to be recognizable, the personality, and then you're off and running. But that's kind of key to it. And people that are controversial are wonderful for puppets.
So in a sense, it starts with that endpoint. Is what is the kind of audience going to be in terms of recognition?
They decide, there'll be a puppet meeting. Who are we going to do? Allegra Stratton's going to be talking for Boris. Is she important? No. Didn't you see the bit about Carrie over the weekend? Princess Nutnut. And then we have to make Carrie in 2.5 days. Brilliant.
Well, and Matt, from your point of view, coming in as a writer and voice artist, what's the experience for you?
Well, it's really interesting because, so for instance, Cummings being an alien, I think, is a really good example of, certainly at the point I got involved, that decision had been taken, Cummings is an alien, and then from then on, you're always writing with this idea that, is he from Durham or is he from Epsilon 5, which was the planet we said he was from. With other characters, as with any comedy show, their caricatures and their traits will kind of evolve over the series and over time. So Matt Hancock, it's fairly predictable. He was always going to be a bit of a drip, and he's caricatured with quite a sad face. But one of the running jokes we had was him constantly hiding behind a plant in the cabinet office. And that just happened in one sketch, and then that became a kind of running thing. That wasn't a decision taken at a macro level before episode 1. These things kind of evolved. So it's a mixture of, effectively, at Roger's stage, where they decide this particular puppet is going to have physical attributes that can't change. That then locks you into certain jokes. And then there are others that are more elastic as time goes on.
It's observation by the various artists involved. Douglas Hurd, who many of you won't remember, but we gave him, he had this sort of white hair that we turned into a cornet ice cream. But Harry Enfield listened to him, and he was, you didn't realize it, I hadn't realized it. He's permanently irritated. And so he speaks with this irritation in his voice. And you don't notice it when he's on the radio or on the television, but when Harry caricatured that aspect of him, you've got this irritable bastard sounding off every week. And that's a wonderful contribution to the whole.
Since we've gone back in time slightly, Roger, can I ask one of the questions from the audience, which was to ask you, what was, which puppets were your favourite? Can you talk a little bit about that? Or even if there were some which you wish you hadn't made, which didn't work?
My favourite puppets is anyone that gets used every week. The Queen was wonderful. We didn't have to keep remaking puppets. I mean, we made over 1,000 puppets for Spitting Image. And I basically hate puppets. They were a means to an end. They allowed you, they were a wonderful vehicle. But I can't say I ever woke up wanting to make puppets. But it works. So I don't like them much, to be honest with you. But if they work, like Greta on the current show, or Jungen Klopp, who's always so positive, and even the dreadful Govey. I mean, they had a sketch which I really enjoyed, Govey in Paris, which they could have run every week as far as I was concerned. Those are the puppets you want.
Roger, did you use the same Queen puppet from the earlier series, the 80s, 90s series for this one? Did you age her?
No. I gave it to the person that made the 80s one. And in the end, we had to take him off it because he kept doing the 80s one. He hadn't realized he's 100 years old and gave it to somebody new. And no, it's a new one.
Roger, I wonder if I can just ask you again, one from the audience. Not everyone will know that Spitting Image started in Cambridge, which, there were many reasons why we wanted the archive to be the University Library for our researchers, for our students, for future generations. That long line of political satire, which we talked about at the start and you referenced in your slides. But Spitting Image also began in Cambridge, didn't it? I mean, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how it started and how that was catalysed.
My stint at art school coincided with Peter Cook at Cambridge. And I got to know him, and he's completely ruined my life because I could have been a fine artist. I could have been a contender, but I was corrupted by cooking. And we did a cartoon for the Observer, and then he had a nightclub and a satire club that I used to do 14 feet of drawings every week. And in the kind of way, it's addictive. And so I've been doing the same old crap since I was about 19 years old. And it was all started, as you say, in Cambridge.
Yeah, we're really proud to have the archive here. We've probably got time for kind of one more question, which I hope is one that all of you will be willing to touch on. And perhaps I could start with Matt, as the next generation, if you like, of satirists. Does satire matter? What difference does it make?
Well, I think it always matters because it's a sign you live in a healthy and functioning democracy. Is how far can you go in lampooning the powerful and the influential? I think what's interesting is that listening to and reading the accounts of satirists, particularly in the 80s, people who worked on Spitting Image and were making other satirical shows, is the lesson I think that my generation of satirists learned is you're not going to bring a government down. That doesn't mean what you're doing isn't important. What you are doing, I think, is helping shape a public perception about really important people. And there is a form of political education and of kind of news education that goes along with making a satirical show. Is that you're delivering actually quite important stuff. Accountability, recognition is such an important part of accountability. You're framing these people in people's minds. So firstly, you're making people bigger deals in terms of people will know more. I mean, I think on a year like this, people would have known Rishi Sunak and Matt Hancock because they were on telly so much. But out of unusual years like this, you're helping set these huge figures in the public mind. And I think that's really important. And as a result of that, you're helping frame them in a particular way. And I think there's two elements to it. One is just the really comedic kind of silly stuff about the voice and the face and the daft jokes you can do. But there also, in some of the sketches, has to be that grain of truth to it. To the stuff about Boris, the stuff about Trump, it really resonates because there's a fundamental truth at the heart of it. So in a way, what you're doing is having great fun and silly voices and everything else, but also it speaks to a fundamental human truth. And I think that's why it's so powerful.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come to Lucy and then give the final word to Roger, as it should be.
Well, Matt's anecdote earlier about primary school and people talking about Spitting Image, which absolutely corresponds to my own memories of Spitting Image and the place it played in my own childhood, says it all really. If primary school kids in the playground are talking about politics and talking about the latest character, then, we don't have to worry about people disengaging from politics. And, I do think that public life has been quite challenged episodically and certainly in recent times by the idea that you can sort of get away with anything. Satire doesn't allow you to get away with anything. And, Cummings will never be able to live down his drive to Barnard Castle. It'll always be there for satirists. Priti Patel will not be able to live down and put behind her the bullying accusations because, she's always going to be a Dracula on Spitting Image. And, that helps overcome, I think, the worrying tendency for politicians to think bad stuff can happen and, no heads will roll. So yes, it's all the more important.
Roger, any final words on that topic?
I think it's very important. Otherwise, I'd have to get a proper job. Paul Foot, I was talking to Paul Foot, who's no longer with us, but we used to bring him in to advise on the politics. And I said, well, it's all pretty pointless. It doesn't change anything. He said it does, because all the children going to school now know who run the country. And with this current Spitting Image, it does help me because I don't really know who Chrissy Teigen is, or the guy that designed the car. I've already forgotten his name. So I have to ring up my grandchildren because it's too embarrassing to ring up Avalon, who I work for, and say, who are these bloody people, So it works both ways.
I think that's a great note to leave on. And I'm so glad you still have a job, Roger. Glad for us and glad for all of the people around the world who are loving the new series of Spitting Image. Thank you so much, everyone.